would like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary is on the traditional lands of the Niitsitapi Blackfoot Confederacy, which include Kainaiwa, Siksika, and Piikani, and the peoples of Treaty 7, including the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, Chiniki, Wesley, and Bearspaw, and the Tsuut'ina First Nations. In addition, the City of Calgary is homeland to Métis Nation Region 3.
Thank you so much for that land acknowledgement, Sandy. Oki nistu ni danigo sabinaki nimokdo do agena. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my session on creating an ethical space of engagement in curriculum development processes. I'm really excited for this talk. I'm excited to be able to share with you just some of my knowledge and some of my thinking. This is going to be more of a rather casual talk. I've got my notes that I'm going to be sharing with you. I've got a presentation I'm going to be sharing with you as well. And I really would like to encourage dialogue. I'd like, if you have any questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat. And Sandy, if I can just ask you maybe to keep track of the chat. And if, I'm not a huge, if I'm talking and you've got a question, please feel free to raise your hand. And Sandy, I'm fine with you letting me know that there's questions waiting. So I'm really hoping that we could get some good dialogue generated here this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with you and get started on the presentation. All right, so let's get started right from the start. So as I mentioned, the title of the workshops are, and this is the first workshop in a series of four, excuse me. So the title of my workshop is, the title of this and the other ones is really around, the workshops are centered around the ethical space of engagement in curriculum development processes. These are the Indigenous guiding principles for curriculum development projects. And again, this is the first workshop, and this workshop really centers around identity and positionality. So maybe, I hope you don't mind. I do plan on recording these sessions just so they can be put up on our TI website and for future reference and as a resource for others to learn from. So I don't know, Sandy, if we started the recording of the sessions, but if we haven't, would you mind recording? And I hope everybody is okay with that.
Yep, I'm recording.
Sandy, are we recording?
Yep, we're recording, and we've got lots of thumbs
wonderful
up as well.
So what I have in store for you for today is, so what I've got in store for you today is I'm just going to position myself in the context of this work. So who am I? Where do I come from? And of course, why does this matter? I'll give an overview of the series, including the purpose of the principles, the context of the principles, look at paradigms, knowledge, and dialogue, the role, especially the role of dialogue in curriculum development processes. And I think both from an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous perspective, I think as curriculum developers, we can appreciate the role of dialogue and consultation and in curriculum development processes. Looking at what makes Indigenous Indigenous ways of approaching curriculum development. What makes those ways distinct? What are some distinct approaches? And it's important for us to look at these parallels, these distinctions, I should say, in order to be able to identify parallels. And then we'll look directly at this first curriculum principle, the ways of being, and why do we look at identity in curriculum development? Why is it important that we're going to be looking at identity? And then we'll look at trying to focus on putting the principle into action. And for that, I'll offer some frameworks to do that. And then again, this whole workshop series really centered around dialogue. And so I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to have some meaningful dialogue. But I wanted to quickly share a little bit about why I've what has motivated me to do this work. So really my work is really based on how I experience Canadian society, how I experience Eurocentric knowledge and Eurocentric education, as well as of course my professional experiences as an Indigenous educator. My most recent work, I would say, is really concerned with establishing how current Indigenous awareness, cultural competency training approaches are very insufficient to address the overall sort of culture of not knowing, the culture of this overall ignorance or lack of awareness of non-Indigenous people in terms of who Indigenous people really are. So this authentic understanding of who Indigenous people are. So it really is around this particular work around curriculum development emerges from a desire to shed light on the absence of Indigenous people, places, knowledges, and perspectives in the curriculum planning processes. So I start every single one of my presentations off the same way. I always position myself and and connect my genealogy directly to the land. So this is part of that positioning process. And so this is what I consider a symbolic Nanastico Chief Mountain, that which overlooks my Indian Reserve, the Blood Indian Reserve, as well as the Blackfeet Indian Reservation on the other side of the Medicine Line. Nanastico Chief Mountain is a sacred site for my people, the Blackfoot people, the Niitsitapi people, and it certainly represents my connection and my identity as emerging from the land. And so anytime I declare who I am, I'm always declaring my connection to the land, but also to the waters as well. And so here's just an image of Old Man River. Old Man River also goes through the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot peoples, and very much a part of my identity, just as much I always say, these waters, the waters that flow through the Old Man River, are just as much a part of my identity as the blood that flows through my veins. And so I certainly connect my identity back to the land and to the waters. And this is just a picture of the standoff community on the Blood Reserve, and my nation is the Gaina Nation is part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. There are 4 nations that make up the Blackfoot Confederacy. We have the Gaina, which is my nation, the Bigani, Siksiga and Amskapi Bigani, which is the Blackfeet, our neighbors, our relatives to the south of us. And we are now divided by the international border. So this is, as you can see, the Rocky Mountains overlooks my community, and this is really part of my identity. This shapes who I am, and these are images of my ancestors, and so I'm always so proud to share these images. These are images of my parents and my grandparents and my great grandparents, and this is really important for me to highlight, because oftentimes I've had my identity defined for me by the Canadian government, and certainly Indigenous identity is controlled by colonial legislation. And so it's really important for me to honor my ancestors. And because in honoring my ancestors, I bring Indigenous history alive, and it is relevant to everything that I do now, because we live through our history. History isn't just something that's in the past, it's something that shapes us today. And how do these ancestors and my responsibilities to my parents, how does this shape the way I see curriculum? How does this shape how I approach curriculum development processes? And this is a quotation from that I pulled from the work of Indigenous Hawaiian scholar Manuleni Meyer, who talks about how what we know. She's concerned with epistemology and how we know what we know, and why that matters, and the process of how we generate knowledge, right? And what is knowledge? And why should that matter? And you know, this is really important for Indigenous people, this idea of knowing, of coming to know, of the different ways that we come to know, ways of knowing, right? And the different sources of knowledge. This is something that we're very concerned with. And we're concerned with advancing this understanding of not only just what we know, but how we know. So these are truly how we know are the epistemological foundations of our culture, because it really is at this conceptual level of thought that Indigenous people have been most misunderstood. And we've been talking about ways of knowing since settlers have been coming onto these lands. And we also talk about the fact that culture matters, and culture frames everything we do. It informs our knowledge systems, it informs our social systems, it informs our family systems. And so how we experience our culture, that matters as well. How others perceive our culture, that's important, and whether others care about our culture, that makes a difference as well. And we're very concerned with entering into dialogues about what it means to be a good human being. So what constructs our humanness? Because our humanness has been defined for us. And too often we've been stripped of our humanness. So we really look at knowledge, we look at ways of being, we look at culture, and we look at how all of these components create our ability to become fully human. And so what does it mean to be fully human? That means something different for Indigenous people, and we come to be human in very distinct ways. According to Maori scholar Hirini Matunga, Indigenous development, Indigenous planning provides an intellectual and political space for Indigenous people to define themselves, to spatialize our indigeneity, and most importantly, for us to mark out our future. So what is development? What is planning? It's from an Indigenous perspective. So first of all, it is planning with Indigenous people. It's not planning for Indigenous people. It's using, or at least being cognizant of Indigenous processes, Indigenous development, Indigenous planning processes to achieve Indigenous defined outcomes. So it's not just process for the sake of process or planning for the sake of planning, but rather it is really this process that we're concerned with. So these principles are about the process of curriculum development. So we're really concerned with creating this a theory or a praxis and this third space for Indigenous curriculum development to connect with institutional standards of curriculum development through relationships, through institutional connections between these two systems, so that we can really change and transform the experiences of Indigenous people in the institution. And so this is really the at the heart of what motivates me. So my identity and also to these distinctions between what development and planning mean for Indigenous people. What are those aims? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the purpose of the curriculum principles, and so that it really follows this very I would say often overlooked reality that who we are as Indigenous people, or how we come to know, and the choices we make within our professional pursuits are directly informed by our culture. And not even just for Indigenous people, this is for everyone. So, you know, who we are, how we come to our knowledge, this really frames the choices that we make in our profession. And you know, that is definitely, culture is at the heart of that. So the purpose of this first principle is to embody this critical act of naming where our knowledge and power comes from. Brazilian educator Paulo Freire challenges us to name our existence in this world in order to transform it. So transformative pedagogy must begin with self-reflection and self-awareness. And the principles, the guiding principles, provide a framework that opens up an ethical space wherein curricular practices are transformed, thus transforming the reality and experiences of Indigenous people in academia. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of the principles. Thank you, Ivy. I love showing. I always my heart just is filled with love and inspiration when I get to see images of my ancestors. So anyways, back to overview of the principles. So the notion of planning, the notion of development and planning are important activities and structure certainly our institutional pursuits, right? And they structure our governance and validation of a specific way of coming to knowing. Coming into knowledge, and curriculum development shapes the contemporary ways that we organize our learning spaces and fulfill our relationships within place. And so this is really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about how we're going to do curriculum development. And so the principles have been really shaped around our Indigenous strategy, the Adapt-Dope Indigenous strategy, and they've been inspired by the ethical space, which is understood as this conceptual space that's intended for respectful and critical dialogue, which will often force us into those uncomfortable spaces of making the implicit explicit. Ongoing dialogue encourages an interplay between thoughtful, critical reflection, which in turn provides clarity that enables us to develop transformative parallel processes. So the ethical space is really a way to interface between two very disparate paradigms, the Indigenous and the Western. And these principles will also allow Indigenous lifeways to be reflected in the curriculum. Indigenous ways of knowing and being are process driven and cultivate ethical relationship building in order to promote informed decision making. And so the first principle, the one we're concerned with today, is around ways of being, that transformational, and it's about transformation, renewal. So to understand and identify how your personal values and beliefs influence curriculum. So to really create an intentional space for us to dialogue about it, for us to think very deeply about our knowledge, our relationship to power, all of that. The second principle is around shared space, ethical space. So this is about relationships, right? Ways of connecting. So the principle of cultivating relational accountability in curriculum development, in the curriculum development approaches. And so this isn't just simply about consultation. And I want to really highlight that in our next workshop is, what is relational accountability? How is that different from consultation, but also to where are those parallels, right? Because in order for it to make sense to us, we're going to need to be able to parallel these principles with what we already know, right? And then that helps us to give an entry point, like that's an entry point for us to start going in a different direction, or a direction that sort of is a little bit murky and we're unsure of, and that's discomforting for us, but that's necessary for transformation. And then ways of knowing, so doing and connecting. So the principle of practicing reciprocity, it's, so how are you giving back to the Indigenous community through your through your curriculum development processes. And then the last one is about validation, the principle of validating the curriculum through a parallel process. And this really recognizes the authority, the knowledge and expertise of Indigenous people as self-determining entities in the curriculum development process. So that's just a brief overview. And so I want to highlight some of the concepts that are at the heart of our Adapt-Dope Indigenous strategy. Oftentimes when I'm doing my consults, people will come up to me and they'll meet with me and they'll say, how do we do this? Like, how can we incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing in a respectful way? How can we include Indigenous ways of knowing? What are the frameworks that we need to look at? What kind of advice can you give us for creating a really meaningful educational experience? How could we prepare our faculty for working with Indigenous people? How could we prepare our students for practicum placements, for example? I always say the same thing. Our strategy, our Indigenous strategy, contains concepts and critical entry points for reflection, for relationship building that will transform how we approach relationship buildings, and relationship building. And it really is focusing on developing these transformative parallel processes. So the first principle, it really opens up an ethical space to reveal the notion of the null curriculum, that which is not taught. Sometimes we ignore some content or skills, either deliberately or unknowingly. We might consider some ideas unimportant and ignore them. We might avoid detailed descriptions of some, such as indigenous economies and trade in a business class. So the null curriculum has really driven the failure of transmitting certain knowledge, skills, or attitudes for many different reasons. And the null curriculum is really driven by our paradigm. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide, but certainly these concepts, this whole idea of a shared space, an ethical space towards a journey of transformation, towards a journey of renewal. So the Adapt-A-Dope holds critical reflective points that will help us to understand the role of dialogue. We're about making the implicit explicit, right? Thoughtful, critical reflection and curriculum development processes. And when I say critical reflection, it really is about understanding how power is embedded in the curriculum development processes. And again, about informed decision making too. So I'm just gonna go back, or I'm gonna jump ahead now to look at the idea of paradigms, personal knowledge, and the role of dialogue. And this is really important to keep in mind, because as I said, our paradigms, it is our paradigm which gives shape to the null curriculum, the absence of, which gives shape to that which we leave out. And Indigenous, it's important to keep in mind that Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing are shaped through a relational paradigm. The relational worldview of Indigenous people is certainly expressed through that familiar axiom, all my relations. And so if we can think about it within and put a little bit of a visual to it, we have at the heart of everything, at the heart of the paradigm, we have our ontology, which is our existence. Ontology is concerned with the nature of reality, with the nature of our existence. And for First Nations, we exist because of our relational and sacred responsibilities. And talking about sacred, I'm referring to that which is beyond the physical. So a First Nations ontology reinforces this view of abundance, meaning that there are adequate resources to go around for everyone and everything to live sustainably, so long as we govern human relationships accordingly. At the heart of the ontology is that we have this very expansive notion of time. Time doesn't drive what we do, time just is. There's this interdependence with all matter on earth and an interdependence with the universe, and that there are multiple dimensions of reality. When I was developing these principles and checking back with the elders, and I should have mentioned that right at the beginning, is, I talked about what drove me to develop these, but it's not as if I just did this by myself, and just pulled all of these ideas off the top of my head. I mean, certainly these principles have been validated through constant back and forth with the Circle of Advisors, the Office of Indigenous Engagement, with my curriculum development colleagues, and with others. And so going back to this notion of abundance, I'm not, when I'm talking about abundance, I'm not just referring to resources, because I think when we talk about abundance, we think of that, oh, there's lots of resources to go around, but really abundance in the sense that there is such a potential for growth, because the universe is a giver of gifts. And by that, we mean we are constantly learning. The universe is constantly giving us gifts of knowledge and gifts of learning, and it really is up to us in terms of how we're going to use that. And so also too, if we can think about, so we have at the center is our existence, right? And then we have the, epistemology around that, our knowledge. So our knowledge is informed and shaped by our existence, right? And the purpose of existence. And so if we believe that we exist because of our relational and sacred responsibilities, and then the way our knowledge system is going to be reflective of that, right? So in the words of Maori Indigenous scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith, she says, we have, for Indigenous people, we have a different epistemological tradition that frames the way we see the world, the way we organize ourselves in it, the questions we ask, and the solutions we seek. Epistemological differences underlie conflicts between Indigenous people and settler governments, but little is widely known about epistemology, or which is that theory of knowledge that is based on Indigenous perspectives, such as relationality, the interconnection of the sacred and the secular, and holism. The emotional, spiritual, cognitive, and physical dimensions of knowledge are common in Indigenous epistemology. So there are multiple sources of knowledge. There are multiple well springs of knowledge. So for myself, I'll give you an example. I had a dream back in 2012 that really set me on a trajectory, a life trajectory that I've been following ever since, but I feel has really been my life's calling. So that came through a dream, and so that is a source of knowledge for me. That is a source of life knowledge. And so that's just an example of that. And certainly the way we teach the pedagogy or transmission of knowledge and culture, the way we teach is going to be shaped by our epistemology. So pedagogy from an Indigenous perspective is the method and practice of teaching that focuses on the development of the human being as a whole person. So the notion of learning through experience, recognizing the important role that elders have in passing on wisdom and knowledge, and honoring the learning spirit. So the learning spirit is this entity that guides our learning beyond family, beyond community, and even beyond elders. It's an Indigenous concept that spirits travel with individuals and guide us, offering inspiration and the unrealized potential to be who we were always meant to be. So looking at the ethics piece, and the ethics is sometimes referred to as the axiology of a culture. What are the ethics of a culture? So what are the ethics of Indigenous people? Ethics are contextualized within a need to maintain our identity as Indigenous people. Speaking from a Blackfoot perspective, Blackfoot ethics are connected to our spirituality and practicing our ceremonies in order to keep us in a state of harmony and balance. Ethics are further defined as our responsibilities to our relational alliances and our vow to the natural world to act as guardians and protectors, because we are all unequivocal unequivocally dependent on the land, on the plants, and other living entities for our very survival. This dependency requires respect and reciprocity. Ethics are also about our behaviors. Our behaviors and actions are understood as the embodiment of our spiritual responsibilities to our relationships. Ethics are about our commitment to ensure the continuity of Blackfoot culture. The Blackfoot language connects us to our ethical responsibilities, and the language itself is the embodiment of our ethics. So that's the paradigm, and that's why, I don't think we're given the opportunity to reflect very deeply on how these interconnected concepts that make up a cultural paradigm, how these shape curriculum development processes, and this idea of going back to the idea of knowledge, right? And how the first principle is really asks us to examine what our relationship to knowledge is, so really thinking deeply about what the sources of our knowledge are, seeing beyond solutions. So not just looking ahead and saying, okay, these are problems that I need to solve, right? But really reflecting on what the nature of those problems are and what gives us the authority to define problems for Indigenous people, or to define Indigenous people as problems. So these principles truly call upon settler and other non-Indigenous educators and curriculum developers to examine their own truths and the possibility of rebuilding or building a relationship with Indigenous knowledges, with Indigenous people. So exploring how you know what you know helps to identify limitations, helps to identify gaps in knowledge, as well as possibilities for growth. So we ask questions like, what is knowledge? What is the knowledge that I'm trying to generate through this curriculum? And the value of knowledge is truly in our relationship to knowledge, not just the outcome. Hawaiian scholar Manuleni Meyer says that if we wish to understand what is unique and special about who we are as cultural people, we will see that our building blocks of understanding, our epistemology, and our relationship to experience is fundamentally different. Like, we need to be able to understand those distinctions as well. And the role of dialogue is important in this. So it's not so, okay, it's important to look at your identity and have this, engage in these self-reflective questions, but also to dialogue about it and have that space to build relationships. So dialogue is about relationships. It's about transparency, being transparent, and it's about possibilities. So curriculum development, for those of us who do curriculum development as our career, know that it demands dialogue. And I think we sometimes confuse consultation with dialogue, though, yet it is dialogue that transforms our practices and relationships and requires specific skill sets such as humility and deep listening. And as I mentioned, about the null curriculum, in the context of the null curriculum, the Indigenous paradigm addresses the absence of Indigenous perspectives and experiences in curricula processes. So students are learning something the null curriculum perspectives and peoples and indigenous histories, and I'm not talking just the Indian residential schools because that's Canadian history, but indigenous history. In the absence of that, when students are not learning about that, they are also learning that indigenous people do not matter. And that leads to the indigenous erasure, the erasure of indigenous people from these lands. So if students are not taught and expected to question critically, to question or to critically examine and call out, for example, sexist language in books, they are learning something that it may not be essential for them to engage in this work of critique and exposure. So what is absent and not included in the curriculum can be immensely present in what students are learning. And I think this is a really, really important concept for us to keep in mind. So I highlighted, and I think I addressed this question about, what is the impact of the absence of Indigenous perspectives and experiences in curriculum, or even if we're not thinking about the absence, but thinking about how Indigenous perspectives are included in very surface level or oftentimes very tokenistic ways, what is the impact of that, and I'm just going to stop there for a bit and just see. I just want to check with anyone if anyone has any questions or any reflections they wanted to offer before I get into the next slide. Just feel free to unmute your microphone. Yes, Caitlin, I am saying the null curriculum. Maybe I'm not saying it right. Yeah, Sarah says, I'm just really struck by the concept of null curriculum and the way the absence of types of knowledge and history also to teach students something. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it, but having that opportunity to really reflect on that and what does that mean for our curriculum development processes? I think there's a lot of value in that. Thank you so much, Patty. Absolutely lots to think about. All right, well, I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So curriculum development approaches, let's look at some of the distinctions so we can start identifying parallels. So what is curriculum development? What do we mean when we talk about curriculum development? So we're talking about planning a course or a program, including learning outcomes and objectives, instructional strategies and materials and assessments. Curriculum development is the process by which an instructor or institution creates or adopts that plan for a course. And but I think it's really important to keep in mind that there are many different schools of thought for how best to approach the curriculum development process. Oftentimes, curriculum development might be used interchangeably with instructional design, for example, but instructional design is really looking at specifically at the student's learning experience, right? And it's part of curriculum too, so I think. And yesterday I was in a meeting with my colleagues, and we talked about the limitations of how even our own limitations of how we see curriculum development. And I remember my one colleague, and I don't know, Kim, if you're in here, but she mentioned that it's really important to broaden our how we see curriculum development, what we think about when we're doing our curriculum planning. And I think she said it's a very complicated process, right? And it absolutely is.
Okay,
But it's important to understand that curriculum development can include the learning environment of the student as well. Oh yeah, please.
sorry, there's just a few comments in the chat here. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. I'm just going to mute my microphone for a moment.
No, you're all good. There's just a few comments in the chat. Ivy said, I'm looking at the question at the bottom of
yeah, so a few comments here. I am looking at the question. So Ivy says here, I am looking at the question at the bottom of the slide and thinking that one of the impacts may be that students feel disconnected from each other, from their own selves, and from the land. Absolutely. But even let's think about the land too, because land is such there's such a you know, the way Indigenous people, the relationship to land for Indigenous people, and the way land is thought about today as really a resource for our own advancement, right? How do we connect students to their own homelands is something that I'm really concerned with when I do my curriculum development. So understanding that the way that this land it emerges out of this land has grown a specific culture, a specific languages that for example, the Blackfoot people from these lands, the land shaped the language, the land informs our culture. So I deliberately designed my curriculum in a way where I'm offering all students an opportunity to connect with their homeland. And so they can feel connected to that. And maybe they have never even been there. But let's learn stories. Tell me a story about your land. Rona, key text on the null curriculum, absolutely. Eisner, writing on the null curriculum. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Rona. Kimberly, the curriculum as a complicated conversation, and here we are. Here I am doing my best to highlight that complicated process. So let's look at some Indigenous approaches to curriculum development, and let's look at some institutional approaches. So from an Indigenous perspective, utilizing this distinctions-based Indigenous pedagogies and planning perspective. So the importance of moving over in curriculum development processes to make room for Indigenous epistemological sovereignties. This is quite different. This is quite a different demand than simply including Indigenous ways of knowing. So the agenda that Indigenous people set is a self-determined one, rooted in the laws and sovereign practices of distinct Indigenous nations. So this idea of distinctions, I think, really pushes back against sort of the common practice of pan-indigeneity, right? Where people are using that it's okay to use a pan-Indigenous approach and when designing learning experiences. The starting point in an Indigenous approach is the self. So starting with that positionality all the time. This emerges from our ethics and the notions that we exist within a web of relational alliances. And knowing self is, and connecting with self is the first starting point in order to connect with others and really connecting with our own experiences as human beings. From an institutional approach, we often approach curriculum development through a lens of cultural neutrality. You know, culture is not certainly some of the ideologies that drive Western culture are not transparent in the curriculum development process. And the starting point is not necessarily the individual curriculum developer who is looking at their experiences, looking at their relationship to knowledge, their relationship to power. The starting point is the conception of ideas. What kind of ideas do I want to get across in this curriculum or in this program? What is important for students to know? So we really look at the outcomes, right? And this next one is this relationship building with rights holders from an Indigenous perspective. And the institutional approach is consultation with institutional leaders and stakeholders. This one is a complex one because it is political. Relationship building with rights holders. As was clearly established in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, Indigenous nations are rights holders and not simply stakeholders due to treaties, policies, and specific rights that are entrenched in laws, as well as their status as distinct societies in Canada. Acknowledging this fundamental difference enables for a better understanding of the role of First Nations, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous-led organizations in curriculum projects. These inherent rights add to the complexities of relationship building, especially around the issues of academic freedom and control over curriculum concepts and how they're being used, or control over knowledge. So this is important because it allows non-Indigenous people to work with Indigenous nations to protect Indigenous knowledge, not to simply appropriate Indigenous knowledge or decontextualize it, or use it in ways where it was never meant to be used. So this, I think this adds to that to that complexity. And it's important though, because curriculum enforces certain cultural products and cultural ways of knowing. And that's important for us to keep in mind. Parallels as well, we're looking at validation and approval, right? And then from an Indigenous perspective, from an institutional approach, we're looking at the validation as well and approval processes. From an Indigenous perspective, we're looking at renewal. From an institutional approach, we're looking at curriculum review, but also renewal as well. So that discourse is coming in, the idea of curriculum renewal. So these are some differences, but also some parallels. So the early phases of the process of curriculum development involve deep research and analysis to ensure that students get the best education possible. So the most effective approaches for course development, and specifically are those that specifically address the needs of learners, right? And so address the needs of all learners. So if we're using a one-size-fits-all approach to curriculum development, I don't think we're addressing the needs of all learners. And so these are just some critical points that I wanted to highlight. I'll stop there and just open it up just to see if anybody has any comments or anything to add. Matthew, please.
Hi, this is a great presentation. It's very thought-provoking. My question is, it makes a lot of sense about Indigenous groups for a particular curriculum. How does one go about that? There are many non-Indigenous curriculum developers. And you might already be going into this later on in the presentation, but it was just one thing that sort of stuck out at me, like how does one go about doing the things that we're talking about here?
Thank you, Matthew. And I think in terms of, and I'll get into this more in our next workshop around ways of connecting, right? But I think it's important, this is relevant. And so relationship building is complex, right? I keep going back, Kim, to what you said about the complexity. And it was funny when you said yesterday, maybe that's a bit of a cop-out, but it's true, it is complex, right? And so Matthew, it's really, reflecting on, what am I comfortable with in terms of relationship building? If I don't know the resources on campus in terms of where are Indigenous people, why is it so difficult to connect with Indigenous colleagues? And so reflecting on that's going to illuminate and allow for just sort of deeper deeper engagement with this idea of absence, right? And so how do you begin relationship building? What makes me comfortable to build relationships? What keeps me in my comfort zone and what takes me out of my comfort zone? Well, maybe it's uncomfortable to think of why it's so hard to connect with Indigenous people. Where do I start? Why is that not a natural process? Why is that not available to us as non-Indigenous curriculum developers, as non-Indigenous faculty members? Why is this not such a natural process, right? And then so we begin to start seeing, but that still doesn't answer like the practicalities of how do I begin reaching out and where do I start, right? Right. What I would say is we have the Office of Indigenous Engagement on campus, right? And we also have the Writing Symbols Lodge, which is really focused on providing connections with students, or support to students, but certainly I think understanding relationship building and this first principle around self-reflection and self-awareness, we're given that opportunity to look at, well, what am I comfortable with and what am I not comfortable with? And how is it that this is such a difficult process to make connections with Indigenous people? I know that probably doesn't answer your question.
No, it does. Sorry to interrupt. It does actually. I loved it. The answer was fantastic because I see it as as an awareness that allows us to transform the structural incompatibilities for the practical things that need to occur. So we've got a practical problem, but the problem is that there's so much structural incompatibilities that solving the practical problem will lead to a transformative event, a collective event that I think is what I think you're getting at. I don't know if I'm correct in that, or if you agree, but that's sort of what I got from your answer, if that's.
No, absolutely, Matthew. I think that is that's exactly what I'm saying. And so and you definitely captured it a lot more eloquently than I was able to, but thank you for that. Fabi, or first here, we have a couple of things in the chat, and then Fabian, I'll get to you. I appreciate, Fabiola says, I appreciate sharing some of the parallels and explicit differences between what we as settlers know and Indigenous approaches. Mal asks, what's the key difference between renewal versus review of the curriculum? I'm going to talk about renewal in the context of Indigenous approaches. Okay, that's what I'm going to talk about, because that's really where my and I don't even want to say expertise, but this is where I'm most familiar with. Maybe I can get one of my colleagues to jump in from a institutional perspective, but let me go to the idea of renewal. So the notion of renewal in Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of being, that is at the heart of our ceremonies. That's at the heart of our responsibilities. That's at the heart of our epistemological foundations, is to renew our commitments to our relationship, to renew the processes of how we generate knowledge. The processes of how we generate knowledge are through our relationships. To renew our relationships, our commitments to our relationships is done through our ceremonies, through the songs that we sing, through the dances that we dance, through the stories that we tell. So it's an oral process of renewal. And so I'm always taken to Dr. Leroy Littlebear when he talks about renewal, and how for Indigenous people, renewal is manifested. We sing the same songs that we've sang for thousands of years because they guide our connection to our universal relational alliances. We tell the same stories because that renews our history. See, the notion of renewal relates to our ontological responsibilities. And so renewal, for the way Indigenous people see it, and even in our curriculum development processes, we don't just, we won't and I think we can appreciate this too, even in Western approaches as well. We're always updating our curriculum, right? We're always making changes, or it's always in the state of flux because situations change, because we change. I hope that makes sense, Mel. That's an extremely complicated question, but I'm doing my best to answer it. And given that I'm trying to explain Indigenous concepts using an English language is also very difficult. Kim says here, curriculum review is often linked to institutional processes for quality assurance. This may also be described as a process of renewal, but the language is used differently in different contexts. Thank you for that, Kim. Fabian? Yeah, just go ahead and unmute your microphone.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very inspiring. I'm fascinated by the way you're presenting it and hearing all these new things. My question might be a little bit naive. I apologize, and I'm very well aware. It's interesting that two guys have spoken, but we represent less than 10% in this audience here. But anyway. I jump in. I'm struggling with this idea of me as a very recent, very late settler here in Canada, a white guy from Europe, building all these things into my practice. So I'm struggling with the guidelines of what I'm using and how I'm using it, and sort of not go too far into this appropriation of content. In what I'm learning here from you, all these different terms, important, so I'm struggling a little bit on how do I, as a non-Indigenous person, work with this content and mostly, integrate it into my context for non-Indigenous students as well. So the Indigenous people, as you have alluded before in your earlier answer to it, the absence thereof. So what sort of guidelines can you use to deal with that? On a shorter time frame, obviously long term this will change, but right now, I don't know. Sorry, I'm trying to put it as best as I can.
Well, no, Fabian, thank you for the question. And I think if you weren't struggling and with these concepts, because that's part of it. So if you're not struggling, I would say then you're not doing something, then you're not doing it right. So, struggle, and for lack of a better way of framing it, struggle is part of this, right? Because this is going to be very unfamiliar. These are all new concepts, and what we have, what we move forward with oftentimes is, and I've listened to a Eastern mystic, and sometimes I'm so struck with some of his knowledge when he says how in our Western learning institutions we have confidence without clarity. We move forward with solutions without, or think we should be moving forward with solutions without first really sitting in that struggle. And it's that struggle that transforms our understandings, and we've got to experience it. Knowledge from an Indigenous perspective is really gained through direct experience, right? And I think we can really appreciate that in what we're doing as educators is, we often have to go through that struggle in order to come out on the other side and create or co-create an experience with our students that is really transformative, if that's what our goal is, right? And so in terms of the guidelines, these are not directives. I want to be clear about that. And you'll come to these, either you take them up in a way, in a very direct and intentional way, or you might take up some of them. You might start with baby steps because it's so new. And as you said, you're a newcomer, very newcomer here. So even getting familiar with, or the idea of absence of, right, is maybe that's the starting point, is designing a module, co-designing a module with students around absence, absence of Indigenous ways of knowing Indigenous people, and then going from there and creating learning outcomes with your students along that line. Like that's a really, sort of a very transformative way to learn with your students. And so that's kind of that's what I have to say about that, Fabian. And I know it's not as clear as we'd like things to be in the institution, but that's what, that's the best that I can offer you right now. So let's look at this principle, the principle of understanding and identifying how your personal values and beliefs influence curriculum. So some of the highlights of this principle focus on relationality. So our relationship to our own knowledge, our relationship to our own power. So an indigenous epistemology, how we come to know, is grounded within that notion of relationality. And being in relationship requires a commitment to lifelong learning, a commitment to critical reflection, critical self-reflection. Indigenous ontological responsibilities are grounded in knowing self, knowing identity, which are fundamental to being in good relations to others and everything around us. Being in relation is an entry point for transformational learning through the curriculum development process, because it enables us to consciously reflect on change and growth as a natural part of learning and coming into new ways of developing knowledge. The principle also allows us to see how our identity is inextricably woven into our understanding of knowledge. So this principle in action, what then is the work that needs to be done in planning? So the theory and practice of, understanding, how do we take that theory and put it into practice? So for non-Indigenous, how do non-Indigenous people start attending to the agenda of Indigenous perspectives around curriculum development? So it's really exploring identity. That's the first starting point. And that's what this workshop is concerned with. I don't want to jump ahead too much because we need to understand this part first. We need to really critically reflect on this before we get to the next one. Before we start looking at connections, right? We need that really solid exploration of identity through that critical lens of self-reflection, which can be seen as an attempt to create forms of practice that will activate an ethic of accountability. And I just really like this. I thought this quotation was very powerful. Being responsible for decolonization can require us to locate ourselves within the context of colonization in complicated ways, often as simultaneously oppressed, but also complicit. And I think this is when this idea of being simultaneously oppressed. I hear this quite a bit from my non-Indigenous colleagues who say, Gabe, I want to make some changes. I want to do this. I want to do, that these are the kinds of things I want to design in my pedagogy, but I'm really constrained. I feel very much like I have to follow these institutional standards, and they don't allow, they're so diametrically opposed to me being authentic, that I struggle with that, and as Indigenous people, we struggle with that as well, so it's, how do you work within these systems, right? Where and I really love that point, Matthew, when you said, well, in the process of coming to know our knowledge and our relationship to our knowledge, our relationship to power, the systems will be transformed. And it may not be immediate, but it will, that is a natural outcome of it, right? And so this is these are some of the questions that are taken right from the principle. Bringing that principle to action is really reflecting on these questions. So that idea of critical self-reflection and awareness, where does your knowledge, either personal or disciplinary, come from? How do you know what you know? So what is the purpose of knowledge, and what is important to know, to learn, or to forget? How do we understand an absence of? So the notion of absence of, that the null curriculum is connected to a cult of forgetfulness. According to Australian historian Anna Hybich, forgetting and ignorance are never benign conditions. They do things. Ignorance breeds in a forgetful climate of not knowing by bestowing value on misinformation and failing to question its veracity or authority. In a world of separation and suspicion of the other, hearsay can take on the appearance of fact. Repeated by government and the media, misinformation assumes an aura of authority and authenticity. Specific groups are defined and stereotyped on the basis of these attributes, which are then used to rationalize and normalize their discriminatory treatment. There is an easy slippage between a mindset that promotes the distancing and dehumanizing of racial groups and the acceptance and normalizing of their unequal treatment. In the process, discriminatory practices become normalized to the extent that they are rendered unremarkable and virtually invisible to the wider society, even as they may assume increasingly harsh forms. So this is why I think, this is important to explore these questions in depth. What assumptions do you have about yourself that may be different from the assumptions you have about Indigenous people, Indigenous culture, or Indigenous ways of knowing? And it's really important to understand that Indigenous people are still embodying the laws and principles of our ancestors, that who I am as an Indigenous person and the practices, the paradigm that constructed my culture, this ancient paradigm that has been thousands of years in the making, that still orients me and orients my my relationships. So I have this. This is also taken from the first principle. And this is just putting that principle into action. And so I just had a scenario, you want to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing. Here's what you might do, understand your story. Who are you? Where do you come from? And then there's just some points there that will kind of push you along the way. And then a framework here. I have a couple of frameworks that I wanted to offer as well. So this idea of introspection or manifesting your knowledge through inner exploration. Again, where does my knowledge come from? What are the characteristics of my culture? How did I learn what I know? What are my biases? What are my intentions? But also too, what are my responsibilities? This is really important to keep in mind here, the notion of responsibilities, and then movement towards embodiment and making the implicit explicit. If you're looking at your curriculum, does my learning plan or my curriculum, does it illuminate my intentions? Does it illuminate my biases? Do my biases come through? Does it allow me to meet my responsibilities? Do I feel connected? Does this plan help me feel connected to my students? Why or why not? And then, looking at aligning intentions and behaviors and the effects on relationships. How has this process helped me to embody my learning? You know, in what ways have I grown through this curriculum project? And how can I sustain this process in the future, in future learning? Another framework for inner exploration is you know, again, around some specific questions. So what motivates me to step out of my comfort zone? So you're gonna be looking at some of the concepts that interest you, or the concepts that scare you, right? You know, what are topic areas that you want to learn more about? And this is where sort of the absence comes in, right? You know, if Indigenous people, if I only want to know about Indigenous spirituality or Indigenous perspectives on nature, then there's an absence of holism. What does that mean? You know, why piece, you know, because in an individually driven society such as ours, it's easy to forget our relational responsibilities, and we do have relational responsibilities. You know, the benefit should be for others, the natural world, and in very explicit ways. So how might you learn more about this? How might you learn what is important to you? How does this benefit you? Well, assessing your current knowledge. What are keeping track of your personal insights? What are your strengths? Knowing what you're good at, and then broadening your responsibilities means connecting, you know, and creating relationships. How will I learn more about this? You know, well, what kind of activities can I include? What kind of activities can I engage in? What resources do I need? What kind of support networks are out there? What kind of frameworks are out there to help me learn? What kind of theories might help me? How might I explore other ways of knowing? And then this other question is, you know, how do I think others experience my culture? And I always ask myself this question because I'm so concerned with how I experience Western culture, you know, that I never thought about in the past. I didn't give much thought to it at all, because it was such a, you know, it was so normal. You know, we're experiencing things and we don't stop and assess how we're experiencing it. But I ask myself now, you know, how do others experience Indigenous culture? You know, do they attend powwows? Do they see flashy costumes? They call them costumes. How do they define, you know, Indigenous, you know, who Indigenous people are? It's like, so even how do I think people experience relationships with me? You know, that kind of adds a layer of accountability to whatever it is I'm doing. So it's like assessing relationships, and it's like being transparent in relationships. You know, how's everything? Checking in with others and keeping track of your self-growth. So these are just some frameworks, and I know we only have 5 minutes, and I wanted to leave you folks with this idea that the focus should be on, in this area, curriculum development from an Indigenous perspective. It's really about bringing a critical perspective into curriculum development around the relationship between education and Indigenous people, both historically and even into today. This means fulfilling a demand from myself and other Indigenous scholars and educators who are too often tasked with teaching non-Indigenous people a more critical, accurate, and holistic account of colonial history and race relations. And so, yeah, I'll just stop there. I know we just have like 4 minutes. So we've got something in here in the chat. So yeah, absolutely. You're very welcome. And I don't know, we have time for a couple more questions. If anybody has any burning questions or even any comments before we sign off. But, you know, this question here I'm leaving with you. How do you use self-reflection or reflexivity in your curriculum development practice? I think this is an important one to keep in mind. So I'm just going to stop sharing there, and just thank you for your time and engaging with me.